Hey everyone, my name is Chelsea. Welcome to Little Mountain Ranch. I'm really happy to have you here with me today. Today we are going to do some cooking on my wood cook stove. This is an Elmira oval wood cook stove, and her name is Martha for those of you that are new here. I do a lot of my cooking on this stove in the winter time. And when I came out this morning to get her all lit, so she was nice and hot to do some recipes that I want to make today, I realized that she was really in need of a good clean. And whenever I share anything about my wood cook stove here on my channel, I always get a lot of questions about how I clean this stove. So I thought I would just show you to start out today's video. Later on, we are going to make a chicken pot pie. And this is a recipe out of, let me just show you the cookbook I'm going to be using today. This is the cookbook we're cooking out of today. This one is from 1917. So the chicken pot pie is out of this one. The other recipe that we're going to do today is something called funny cake. And it's not something I had ever heard of before being up here in British Columbia, Canada, but I know it is a recipe that's fairly common in the United States because many of you have suggested that I make it. So we're going to be using the Pennsylvania Dutch cookbook for that one. My husband bought me some antique cookbooks, 2 of these being amongst those, and then another one that's my absolute favorite one I'll show you in a minute. And as I've been sharing about these recipes and these cookbooks here on my channel, several of you have reached out to me with information about the people who owned these cookbooks, because we do have some names that we're working with right now, and I have some information to share with you about them, and I'm really excited to do that. But that'll be a little bit later on, because right now we need to get this stove lit, and in order to do that, we need to get it cleaned up. As you can see here, she is looking pretty dirty. So what we're gonna do to start is pull off the burners. And can you see down here, all of this ash? So this ash is coming from over on this side of Martha, and this is where the firebox is. One of the things that I absolutely love about this stove compared to any other wood cook stove I've used is how huge this firebox is. Here, I'll open it up from this side. Normally, in my experience, wood cook stoves usually only have a firebox that's around the size if you look straight in here, but doesn't go down like this. So I'm able to fit a lot of wood in here, which is absolutely fantastic. But what happens is when you're burning in here, all the smoke and the soot goes up over here, and then that's what heats up the oven down here. Smoke goes out this way, up the back here, and then up the chimney and out the roof. Every, I don't know, couple months or so, I end up needing to clean out about this much ash from this area of the stove. So we're gonna start with doing that. And all of these pieces actually lift right out, but in order to make them a little bit lighter, I always just take the elements off here before I actually remove these pieces, like so. Because Martha has not been lit for the last couple of days, I'm actually just going to use my shop vac over here because I know that there's no hot coals or anything like that that's going to be going into my vacuum. That is the most efficient way to do this. Just make sure that you do have a good filter on your shop vac. Otherwise, all of this dust is going to blow all over your house. So now I just flip over the elements and I'm just going to vacuum those off as well. All I use to wash my stove is hot soapy water. Keep in mind that cast iron does rust, so whenever I wash any cast iron, I always make sure that I dry it off right away. The other thing that I do for any parts of my stove that are particularly dirty is I will use an abrasive sponge, which I'll show you in just a second. Just a regular sponge like this. You could use steel wool too. And I just scrub anywhere that needs a good one. I actually treat the top of my stove very similarly to the way I would treat my cast iron fry pans. and it seems to work just fine. To get into these, sometimes I'll just bring them over to the sink and actually rinse that out, but that's when I'm going to do a really deep clean on my stove. Today, I'm just giving her a good wipe down. So again, I just make sure that I dry off the stove right after I wash it so that it doesn't start to rust. It is not a bad idea to scrub off all of the non-metal surfaces first before you start scrubbing off your really dirty stovetop, just because it does blacken the water, so that way you don't need to go back and replace your water so much. So I will just scrub this backsplash off, and sometimes, like I did with this, I'll add a little extra soap to my sponge. So I'll just do this on all of the non-metal surfaces of my stove. So this is the warming box here, so you can put things up in here to keep them warm. I don't usually use this for much more than just storing the extra pieces of equipment that I have for my stove. One thing about wood cook stoves is they are very dusty. It's not that much different really than just maintaining a regular electric stove. So I have been using olive oil for a long time, but since I got some of this avocado oil, I tried that last time and it worked really well. But the thing about using any kind of vegetable oil on your cook stove is to make sure that you take off pretty much all of it once you spread it around. So I just spread it all over the surface of my stove. Make sure it's fully covered the whole thing. But in order for it to stay nice and shiny and not get kind of ridges on it when this oil starts to heat up, I always take some fresh paper towel and I take off as much of the oil as I possibly can. I am not sure if you can see right here where it's a little bit black. This is a spot where when I used olive oil the first time, I did not rub off nearly enough. So it kind of cooked on there a little bit. And if I wanted to put some elbow grease into it, I could remove that, but I'm not too worried about it. So now, as long as I take off pretty much all of the oil, it kind of makes it a little bit of a non-stick surface so that when food splatters happen on it, they're really easy to wipe off, but it also keeps it nice and shiny looking. I love the look of a freshly polished stove. So I'm just going to grab a fresh piece of paper towel and go again. Now that she's looking all polished and beautiful, I am going to get her lit. Perfect. Okay, so now we're just going to let Martha get heated up. I have all the vents open so that it can get nice and hot. And while this is heating up, we will go and get all of the chicken ready for the chicken pot pie. All right, so before we get into the recipes that we're going to cook, I wanted to give you a couple of updates on Betty's cookbook. So Betty's cookbook is this one, The Art of Cooking and Serving. And when we were trying to figure out the date for some of the newspaper clippings that we found inside of this cookbook, so inside of this cookbook, there's all kinds of newspaper clippings and letters and mementos, things like that in there. We found this one, and this is the newspaper clipping that we got, the first prize holiday sandwich that we made. When was that? A week ago. No, maybe it was only even a couple of days ago, right here. So on the back of this, there are some articles, and we used some of the information from the articles to try to determine the age of this newspaper. And one of them talked about Babe Ruth, and it said Ruth is likely to become the #1 candidate if the deal for the sale of the club to the syndicate headed by Colonel T.L. Houston, former part owner of the Yankees, goes through. And so Dan did some research to try to find out when this sale was going through or when this trade was going to happen, and we determined it was around 1921 or 1922. But we made a mistake. It was actually, because there's reference to a man named Bobby Riggs, who was a tennis sensation during this time period. He was actually being sort of starting to become famous around the mid-1930s. So it wouldn't be possible, and I think he was 16 or 17, something like that. So it wouldn't be possible for him to have been mentioned in this newspaper around 1921, 1922. So we didn't put all of that together until a couple of days ago I received a message from a woman named Jill, hi Jill, over on Instagram, and she had done a little bit of digging into the name of the person, because we do have that information from the first prize winner of the sandwich we made together, and that was Mrs. Howard Livingston. We knew that she was from Ithaca, New York, so she did some research and some digging, and she actually found Mrs. Livingston, whose name is Pauline. Let me see. So her name was Pauline. She was born in Ithaca, and she got married to Howard. So on this it says Mrs. Howard Livingston. So she got married to Howard in 1927 at the age of 15. So she was 15 years old when she got married in 1927. So we know that this newspaper is most likely from beyond 1927. So I'm going to guess if she was winning a first prize competition, that was probably into the 1930s when she had some more experience with cooking, but who knows. She lived until the ripe old age of 93, passing on in 2005. And then she was actually able to find some newspaper clippings, which I will put up on the screen here for you, with her obituary, along with some information about her, and even a photo. So we don't know which one in this photo is actually Pauline, but one of them is Pauline, and I think that's so neat. So let me read to you this comment that came in on that video, and this is just so cool. So this came in from Thomas. Hello, Thomas. I'm so excited to hear that Betty was from Ithaca, New York. That's my address. The newspaper clipping was probably from the Ithaca Journal. I'm 66 years old, and I have met Mrs. Howard Livingston years ago. She had a son named Howard, aka Dewey, and I worked with Dewey. What a small world. Thank you for sharing her recipe. What a small world indeed. What are the chances that I mention this newspaper from back in the 1930s with a name on it, and that somebody who watched this video would have actually met this person? I just think that is the coolest thing. So the mystery of who Pauline Livingston has been solved. So now we're moving on to mystery number 2, and that is to determine the owner of this cookbook. So this is The Art of Cooking and Serving. The newspaper clipping came out of this cookbook, and we call this Betty's cookbook because inside of this cookbook there was a letter written to Dear Betty on November 11th, 1930, and this is signed by Mother. So what we decided to do is to contact the person that Dan bought these from. So Dan bought these cookbooks off of eBay, and ask if maybe they were connected in some way to the person who owned this cookbook. So I want to read to you what they wrote me. Okay, so Dan had written them saying, hey, my wife absolutely loves these cookbooks and she's cooking recipes out of them. And so this person writes back and says, oh, that makes me so happy. I sold these books for an elderly friend. The books belonged to his wife who passed away last year. I'm guessing that she inherited most of them from her mother or her aunts. They came from a small farming town south of Syracuse, New York. They lived in Cortland. She came from a relatively large family who was spread over that area. So all of those handwritten things were more than likely from her mother or her aunts. I looked very quickly through some of the newspaper clippings and the handwritten recipes, and I do think that I noticed some references to Central New York as well. Okay, So I send a letter back to them, explaining to them what I'm doing here with you guys on YouTube and how excited I am about being able to figure out who Betty actually is. And so they have asked that I send them a picture of this letter, which I have done. I haven't heard back from them yet, but also in that they're just away on vacation right now. But what this person is going to do is to show the letter to his friend. And he does know that his friend's wife's maiden name was Phelps. So that's another clue that we have. And then that they're going to get back to me with more information. So I will keep you updated with the search for Betty and the search for the owner of this cookbook, which is my absolute favorite cookbook. I love this cookbook so much. Okay, so we have the inscription on the inside of this cookbook here is Mrs. Eva Gibson is what we think it is, but I'll put it up on the screen. It says, Dan got me this book at Griner's Drugstore, Muntsville, New York, summer of 1917. And the recipe that we're going to make today is out of this cookbook, the chicken pot pie recipe. So we're going to do a little bit of digging and see if we can find some more information out about this person. This is so much fun, you guys. This just has brought being in the kitchen and cooking to a totally different level for me. I have mentioned this before, but cooking is not something that I would consider to be my passion. I am really passionate about food as far as like feeding nutritional food to my family and growing food. I love that part of it, but I've never been a big fan, or at least not for many, many years, of actually being in the kitchen. But doing this, cooking out of these recipes, being connected to people that came before me that cooked like I do has just been so much fun. So we are going to make, I just have to find the recipe again in here, this chicken pot pie. And I love the way that the recipes in this cookbook were written because they're more in paragraph form rather than ingredients and instructions. Okay, chicken pie biscuit crust, that is what this is called. So we have to separate a 3-pound chicken into pieces at the joints. And I don't have a whole chicken, but I do have a bunch of legs and thighs that I have thawing over here in the sink. So these chickens here, so we're going to part those out and use them. So separate a 3-pound chicken into pieces at the joints, wash carefully, cover with boiling water, let boil for 5 to 6 minutes, then let simmer until tender. The chicken will cook in from an hour to an hour and a half to 2 hours. Add salt near the last of the cooking. Let the chicken become cold. For the crust, sift together 4 cups of pastry flour, a teaspoonful of salt, and 4 slightly rounding teaspoons full of baking powder. Work in 1.5 cups of shortening, then mix the dough in with the milk. Take 2/3 of the paste upon a board and dredge with flour. Knead slightly, then roll out to fit in the baking dish enough to hold the chicken. Roll the rest of the paste into a sheet, spread with softened butter, and fold 3 times. Roll to fit the top of the dish. Cut a slit in the top of the crust, put the pieces of chicken in the lined dish, sprinkle in a teaspoon of salt and 1/2 teaspoon of black pepper to 2 to 3 tablespoons full of flour. Add 2 tablespoons full of butter into bits as the chicken is put in. Add 2 that makes sense now. Add 2 tablespoons full of butter in little bits as the chicken is put in. Have ready a sauce made of 2 tablespoonfuls of butter, 3 of 4, 1 cup of cream, and chicken broth. The sauce should be cold. Turn this into a dish over the chicken. Brush the edge of the paste with cold water and set the cover in place. Ornament the cover with bits of paste cut into crescents if it be convenient. Set into a well-heated oven, cover with buttered paper, and let bake about 3/4 of an hour. The pie is often made with only an upper crust. So I'm just going to make a couple of additions to this. I'm going to add some vegetables into this recipe. Actually, that's probably the only thing that I'll do differently. So we're going to do this first. And once we have this recipe done, I love the way that was written. We are going to make funny cake, but it's actually a pie, out of this cookbook. So first we'll start off with the chicken. We are going to take the skin off our chicken, and I was going to part these. So this is the thigh, this is the leg, but I've decided I'm just going to put them right in So I'm going to do 3, 4, 5, 6 legs and thighs for this. So we're bringing this up to a boil for 5 to 6 minutes, and then we're going to turn it down to a simmer. And at that point, I'll move it over to Martha because she'll be hot enough at that point to simmer this for the next hour or so. While that is cooking over there, we will get going. Actually, I'm gonna wash my counter off here first, and then we will get going on the funny cake. Okay, that is now wiped off. Now we will find our funny cake recipe. So this cookbook is the new Pennsylvania Dutch cookbook. This one is a really great cookbook, actually, really good one. And it was published in, I think it was 1958. Yes, 1958. Okay, funny cake, Mrs. Reinert's funny cake, 156. Use half recipe for plain pastry. So I guess we should use the recipe that's actually out of this cookbook. So many pies. So in the Pennsylvania Dutch must have really enjoyed their pies because I have never seen so many pie recipes in one cookbook before. Okay, plain pie crust, and we only want to do a half. So we need a cup of flour. Look at this gorgeous mixing bowl. Isn't this beautiful? Thank you so much, Jean. I love this so much. Okay, 2 cups of flour. Oh, this bowl makes me happy. Okay, so we have 2 cups of flour and half a cup of lard. The recipe calls for shortening, but I don't use shortening, so lard it is. This is the exact same recipe that came from my roll right rolling pin that I showed you guys the other day. So this is exactly the same one. I've already pre-measured my 5 tablespoons of water, so I'm just going to add a little bit at a time. Okay, you know what? I'm just going to actually do this all as one crust, and then I'll just take whatever I have extra and give it to my little one, and she can make her own little pie with it. So now we have to chill that for a little bit. I know lots of people use plastic wrap for this, but I actually haven't used plastic wrap in years and years and years. So I just am using parchment paper instead. Okay, now that we have our chilled dough, we are going to roll this out with my roll right rolling pin. So this is an antique glass rolling pin. When I shared this rolling pin the other day, we were trying to figure out why they stopped making them, besides the obvious glass, you know, being breakable part of it. And several of you mentioned that you thought that it was probably because condensation would form on the outside of these glass ones with the water on the inside on a warm day. And then of course that's not good for making pie pastry. And what they decided to do instead, because the thing that's really nice about this is that it's heavy and it rolls the dough out so beautifully, is they started to make the ones that are made out of marble, like really heavy ones. And that was sort of an upgrade from this style of one, but I still love this one so much. So we're just gonna roll out our pastry dough here. So one thing about me is I do like a thicker pie crust. So I'm gonna make this a little bit thicker for this pie than it calls for. And then, like I said, I'll just give the surplus to my daughter so she can play around with it. Okay, so now we're going to get our pie crust on here. And when I cut off the crust the last time I showed you guys making a pie, so many of you suggested that is not a big enough knife. So many of you suggested not to do that and actually fold over your crust so that you can get a nice thick rim around your crust. That is a fantastic idea. I will do that next time when I do a pie crust that's actually the right size for the pie that I'm making. But I want to be able to give my young one all this extra stuff so she can make her own pie. Whoops, this is sliding off here. That's not gonna work, and I'm gonna get a shrunk pie crust. Darn it. Oh well. Like I said, pie making is not my forte by any stretch of the imagination. All right, little lady, you got a lot of pie crust to play with here. Do you want to clear off a spot on the table so that you can actually do this? So I am supposed to chill this pie crust before we put the filling in, so I'm just going to pop it outside because it is freezing cold out there right now. That will chill it quickly. And then while that's chilling, we will make our filling. And this calls for shortening, but we are going to use butter. So we have also 1 cup of milk, 2 teaspoons of baking powder, and 2 cups of flour. Okay, how is this going to fit into that crust? I do not know. Okay, so now we need, this has a lot of sugar in it because this has another cup of sugar. I'll help you with that in just a sec, sweetie. I'm just gonna get this pie into the oven and then I will come and help you put those together, okay? 1/2 cup of cocoa. I think I have probably exactly that in this bag. And we mix this together and then we add in boiling water, 1/2 cup of boiling water. This is, you guys are gonna go into a sugar coma after this. There is so much sugar in this, but I'll bet you it's gonna taste, I don't know. It sure looks like it's going to overflow, doesn't it? No, the pie crust won't rise.
The batter?
But the batter certainly will.
Right under it.
Yes, I think that is a very good idea. Okay, so now we're going to go pop this into Martha and see what happens. Okay, so now it is just a waiting game. We're gonna wait for the funny cake to finish baking and our chicken to finish cooking on the stove over there, and then we will continue on with making the chicken pot pie. Okay, so we have our chicken all cut up, pulled off the bones, and I added some corn to that, so I'm just going to set that aside. And then I have some lard in my bowl for making the crust, and over here I have the funny pie, which totally exploded over the side, so good thing I put the cookie tray underneath it. That is what it looks like, and it smells really good. So we're gonna have this with ice cream a little bit later on. Right now, my house is overflowing with desserts, and this is actually pretty unusual. I would say we only make a dessert maybe once every couple weeks or so. We'll have like muffins and cookies and stuff, but an actual dessert only every couple of weeks. But right now, we have leftover birthday cake from yesterday. We have chocolate brownie over here that I was recipe testing. And then now we have the funny cake. And we had shoe fly pie last week. What else have we had recently? All kinds of stuff. It's been very sweet. A very sweet period of time in my household, and my kids are loving it. Okay, so what do we need to do here? We need our 1 cup of shortening is what it calls for, but I have lard. We need 8 cups of pastry flour, so I am doubling this recipe. Okay, so we need 8 cups of flour, 2 teaspoons of salt, 8 teaspoons of baking powder, And it says that these need to be slightly mounding, so I won't get picky about leveling them off. So this is basically a baking powder biscuit recipe. Okay, so it doesn't actually tell me how much milk to add into this, but I have done this many times before, so I will just eyeball it. And then it says to put some flour on the counter, and then we'll roll this out. And they call this a paste, not a dough. So I'm assuming that is indicative of the texture that I'm aiming for here. Okay, so now that we have our super fancy looking crust in the bottom of our pan, we are going to put in our chicken and our corn. This is chicken and corn, and fill this right up. Into this, we put 3 to 4 tablespoons of flour, along with a good teaspoon of salt and some pepper. So into this pan, we are going to add 4 tablespoons of butter. And into our butter, we are going to add 6 tablespoons of flour. This feels a little bit redundant because they had us put some flour in with the meat already, but we are going to try to follow this recipe exactly as it is, excluding the use of shortening. Now, it says to add a cup of chicken broth. So we're adding 2 since we're doubling it, and then a cup of cream. Should have done this earlier because it says that the gravy has to be cold before we add it into the crust. So thankfully it's cold outside today, so we'll just pop it outside and cool it off really quickly. I am going to add some seasonings to this because I know that that stock was not super flavorful. So I'm going to add a little bit of poultry seasoning and a little bit of, what else do I want to add in here? Touch of garlic. So here I am talking about wanting to keep the recipe exact, and then now I'm just adding in whatever I want. Okay, so I just put our sauce outside so it can cool off, or the gravy that's going to go into our pie here. Where did I put my rolling pin? There it is. Okay, what it says for the top is to roll it out like so, and then spread with some softened butter, which I'm going to have to go melt some because I don't actually have any butter softened. That's a good thing to do. Yes, this does look good, doesn't it? It's going to be delicious. Gravy? Yep.
Good, because I actually like the crust and the gravy.
The filling, same.
It makes
so
the
delicious.
filling way better.
It does make it good. I agree with you. Okay, so there's our crust. We'll grab our gravy from outside. Now, because crust is the best thing ever, I'm just going to tuck in the crust that's hanging off the side. And then it says to, you know, put some ornamental designs on the top of this. I am not going to do that. However, I am going to poke a couple holes in the top of this. And now we're going to put this in the oven and bake it until it is all golden and beautiful. So I'm going to put this on the cooler side of the stove so that I don't end up darkening the top before the inside actually bakes. I'm going to open up one of my vents here just to get a little bit more airflow in there to keep the stove hot enough to cook that through. And now we wait. A very gorgeous looking pie. I just had it staying warm in the oven. It cooked all the way to the end over in Martha, and I managed to not get the top too dark this time, which is awesome. So now we are going to scoop up a little bit of this. Okay. Look at that. Delicious that looks. I mean, it doesn't really look that delicious in this light, but it does look delicious in real life and smells so good. So let's also cut into this funny cake. Okay, so I don't know if this is the way that this is supposed to be. Is it supposed to be goopy like that? You guys are gonna have to tell me. It looks like it's supposed to be goopy like that. Okay, this with a little bit of ice cream. Oh my goodness. Okay, so we'll try the pie first. It's delicious. It's really good. This is definitely a kid recipe. Kids would absolutely love this. One thing I wish I had put on the top was some cheese, because that would just elevate it to another level, but it's really good. If any of you watched me do this and were like, wait, you're not supposed to do it that way, definitely let me know in the comment section if I did something wrong. But this still looks really good. Oh my gosh. This is so good. Is in my mind the most perfect dessert. It's crunchy, so there's like the crunchy on the outside. There's pie crust. Who doesn't love pie crust? And then there's this chocolate sauce that is out of this world delicious. Wow, if you have not had this funny cake before, you have to have it. It is so good. Dan should be home with the rest of the kids in a few minutes, and they are going to absolutely devour this pie. I know they are going to love it. And then we will finish it off with some of this funny cake, or funny, is it funny cake? Yes, funny cake and ice cream, and they are going to be very, very happy. I would really encourage you to try both of these recipes if you have not already. They are fantastic. I hope you enjoyed today's video, everyone, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Bye.